What would you do if you were sitting in first class, minding your own business, when suddenly the pilot himself walks up to you and demands that you move to the back of the plane? Not because of overbooking, not because of a safety issue, but simply because he doesn't believe you belong there? Today, we're going to tell you the incredible true story of Marcus Washington, a successful aerospace engineer who experienced exactly this situation. But what happened next will absolutely shock you. Because when this pilot tried to humiliate Marcus in front of an entire plane full of passengers, he had no idea who he was dealing with. Marcus didn't just file a complaint. He didn't just demand an apology. What he did was so brilliant, so perfectly calculated, that it exposed not just one racist pilot, but an entire system of discrimination that had been operating in plain sight for years. By the end of this video, you'll understand why sometimes the best response to injustice isn't anger, it's intelligence, patience, and the power of knowing exactly who you are and what you're capable of. So buckle up, because this story is about to take off, and trust me, you won't see the ending coming. It was a typical Tuesday morning in October when Marcus Washington made his way through the bustling corridors of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. At 42 years old, Marcus was the kind of man who commanded respect wherever he went, not because he demanded it, but because he earned it through decades of excellence in his field. Marcus held a PhD in aerospace engineering from MIT and had spent the last 15 years working his way up through the aviation industry. He was currently the Senior Director of Flight Safety Systems at one of the nation's largest airline manufacturers, a position that required him to travel frequently between manufacturing facilities, testing sites, and corporate headquarters. On this particular morning, Marcus was heading from Chicago to Atlanta for a critical safety audit meeting. He had booked himself in first class, as his company always did for executive-level employees on flights longer than 2 hours. It wasn't about luxury, it was about productivity. Marcus often used flight time to review complex technical documents, and the extra space and quiet environment of first class allowed him to work effectively at 35,000 feet. As he approached Gate B12, Marcus noticed the usual pre-flight activity. Business travelers typing furiously on laptops, families corralling children and managing carry-on bags, flight attendants preparing for boarding. Everything seemed perfectly normal. Marcus had his boarding pass ready, seat 2A, first class, window seat. He'd specifically chosen this seat because it would give him the best lighting for reviewing the technical specifications he needed to present at tomorrow's meeting. These weren't just any specifications, they were critical safety protocols that could potentially ground an entire fleet of aircraft if the audit revealed problems. The boarding process began smoothly. Marcus presented his first-class boarding pass to the gate agent, who smiled professionally and welcomed him aboard. He made his way down the jet bridge, entered the aircraft, and was greeted by the lead flight attendant, Sarah, a professional woman in her 30s who had clearly been doing this job for years. "Good morning, Mr. Washington," Sarah said, glancing at his boarding pass. "Seat 2A, right this way. Can I hang up your jacket for you?" Marcus smiled and handed over his suit jacket. "Thank you, that would be great. And could I get some coffee once we're in the air? I have quite a bit of reading to do during the flight." "Of course, sir. We'll have fresh coffee ready shortly after takeoff." Marcus settled into his seat and began organizing his materials. He pulled out a tablet loaded with technical documents, a leather portfolio containing printed reports, and his company laptop. To anyone watching, it was clear this was a business traveler preparing for serious work, not someone trying to fly in a class he couldn't afford or didn't belong in. The passenger in 2B was already seated, an elderly white gentleman who appeared to be a frequent business traveler based on his efficient packing and familiarity with the first-class routine. He nodded politely to Marcus, who returned the greeting. "Traveling for business?" the man asked conversationally. "Yes, heading to Atlanta for some meetings," Marcus replied. "How about you?" "Same here. I'm in medical device sales, so I'm always bouncing between hospitals and corporate offices. The name's Robert, by the way." "Marcus. Nice to meet you." It was exactly the kind of pleasant, Mundane interaction that happens thousands of times every day on commercial flights. Two professionals sharing a brief moment of human connection before settling in for their respective journeys. As more passengers boarded, Marcus continued his preparation. He reviewed his notes on the upcoming audit, cross-referenced technical specifications with safety reports, and mentally rehearsed key points he would need to present. This wasn't just another business trip for Marcus. The audit he was conducting could potentially save lives by identifying safety issues before they became tragedies. The boarding process continued normally for about 20 minutes. Marcus watched as the flight attendants performed their pre-flight duties with practiced efficiency. Everything was proceeding exactly as it should on what appeared to be a routine domestic flight. But then something changed. At approximately 8:47 a.m., just as the final passengers were boarding and the flight attendants were preparing to close the aircraft door, Captain Richard Hastings emerged from the cockpit. This wasn't unusual in itself. Pilots sometimes walk through the cabin before takeoff to make observations about passenger load, check for any obvious safety concerns, or simply stretch their legs before the long hours of flying ahead. Captain Hastings was a man in his late 50s with graying hair and the kind of stern expression that suggested he ran a tight ship. He'd been flying commercial aircraft for over 25 years and had developed what he considered a keen eye for spotting potential problems before they became actual problems. As he walked through the first-class cabin, his eyes landed on Marcus Washington. Something about the scene didn't sit right with Captain Hastings. Here was a young black man in an expensive suit, occupying a premium seat, surrounded by what appeared to be technical documents and high-end electronics. In Captain Hastings' experience, shaped by decades of unconscious bias and racial stereotyping, this scenario raised red flags. Captain Hastings approached Marcus's row and stopped directly beside seat 2A. His posture was authoritative, his voice carried the weight of command, and his expression left no doubt that he expected immediate compliance with whatever he was about to say. "Excuse me," Captain Hastings said, his voice cutting through the ambient noise of the cabin. "I need to see your boarding pass." Marcus looked up from his tablet, slightly surprised by the request. Flight attendants typically handle boarding pass verification, and he'd already shown his pass multiple times during the boarding process. But he maintained his composure and reached for his boarding documents. "Of course," Marcus replied calmly, retrieving his boarding pass from his jacket pocket. "Is there a problem?" Captain Hastings took the boarding pass and examined it with exaggerated scrutiny, as if looking for signs of forgery or manipulation. He held it up to the light, checked the seat number against the overhead bin markers, and generally made a show of his inspection. "This says C2A," Captain Hastings said, his tone suggesting that this was somehow problematic. "Yes, that's correct," Marcus responded, still maintaining his professional demeanor. "That's the seat I was assigned when I booked the flight." Other passengers in first class were beginning to notice the interaction. The conversation between the pilot and passenger was unusual enough to draw attention, and the captain's obvious suspicion was creating an uncomfortable atmosphere in the cabin. "I'm going to need you to move to the back of the plane," Captain Hastings announced, his voice now loud enough for most of the first-class cabin to hear clearly. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus felt the familiar surge of emotions that every person of color recognizes when confronted with discrimination: anger, frustration, disbelief, and the terrible knowledge that this moment would test not just his dignity, but his strategic thinking about how to respond. "I'm sorry, what?" Marcus asked, making sure he had heard correctly. "You want me to move? Why?" Captain Hastings crossed his arms and adopted an even more authoritative stance. "I don't believe this is your actual seat. I think there's been some kind of mistake or irregularity with your boarding pass. For the safety and security of all passengers, I need you to move to an available seat in coach." The accusation was clear, even though it was couched in language about safety and security. Captain Hastings was essentially accusing Marcus of fraud, of somehow scamming his way into first class through deception or illegal means. Robert, the passenger in 2B, looked visibly uncomfortable. He had witnessed Marcus's normal boarding process, had seen the flight attendant's professional greeting, and had observed nothing that would suggest any irregularity. Other first-class passengers were now openly staring, some pulling out phones as they sensed they might be witnessing something significant. Marcus took a deep breath. In this moment, he had several choices. He could comply with the pilot's demand, avoiding confrontation but accepting the humiliation and injustice. He could argue loudly and angrily, which might satisfy his immediate emotional needs but could also play into negative stereotypes and potentially result in his removal from the flight. Or he could do something else entirely. "Captain," Marcus said, his voice remaining calm and professional, "I have my boarding pass, which clearly shows seat 2A. I checked in online, went through security normally, and boarded with my first-class boarding group. The flight attendant verified my boarding pass and welcomed me to this seat. I'm not sure what irregularity you're seeing, but I can assure you that I'm in the correct seat." Captain Hastings' expression hardened. He was not accustomed to having his authority questioned, especially not by someone he had already decided didn't belong in first class. "Sir, I am the captain of this aircraft, and I have the final authority over all passengers and seating arrangements. I'm telling you there's an issue with your boarding pass, and I need you to move. If you refuse to comply, I'll have to call security to remove you from the plane." The threat was clear and public. Every passenger in first class could hear the exchange, and many were now recording with their smartphones. This was exactly the kind of viral video moment that airlines spend millions trying to avoid. Marcus looked around the cabin, making eye contact with several passengers who were watching the confrontation unfold. He saw confusion, discomfort, and in some cases, recognition that they were witnessing discrimination in action. But Marcus Washington was not just any passenger. His 15 years in the aviation industry had given him extensive knowledge of airline regulations, passenger rights, and the limits of pilot authority. More importantly, his current position gave him access to resources and connections that Captain Hastings couldn't possibly imagine. "Captain," Marcus said, reaching into his briefcase and retrieving a business card. "Before we escalate this situation any further, I think you should know exactly who you're dealing with." Marcus handed his business card to Captain Hastings with the same calm professionalism he had maintained throughout the confrontation. The card was elegant but understated, high-quality cardstock with simple black text on a white background. It read, "Dr. Marcus Washington, Ph.D., Senior Director, Flight Safety Systems, Apex Aviation Solutions, Federal Aviation Administration Authorized Inspector." Captain Hastings looked at the card, and for the first time since approaching Marcus's seat, his expression showed uncertainty. Apex Aviation Solutions was not just any company. It was one of the largest aerospace contractors in the country, responsible for safety systems on thousands of commercial aircraft. And an FAA-authorized inspector was someone with significant authority over airline operations and safety compliance. But Captain Hastings had already committed to his course of action in front of a cabin full of passengers, many of whom were recording the interaction. Backing down now would be an admission that his demands had been based on assumptions rather than legitimate safety concerns. "I don't care what your business card says," Captain Hastings replied, though his voice lacked some of its earlier conviction. "I still need you to move. This is about flight safety, not your job title." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, as if considering the captain's position. "I understand your concern about flight safety, Captain. It's actually something I care deeply about, given that it's literally my profession. But I'm curious about something. Can you explain exactly what safety issue my presence in Seat 2A is creating?" The question was reasonable and professionally stated, but it cut to the heart of the matter. Captain Hastings had made his demand based on racial profiling, not legitimate safety concerns, and now he was being asked to articulate a safety rationale that didn't exist. "There are irregularities with your boarding documentation," Captain Hastings said, falling back on his earlier justification. "What specific irregularities?" Marcus asked. "My boarding pass shows seat 2A, which matches the seat I'm occupying. It has the correct flight number, date, and time. The barcode scanned properly at the gate. The flight attendant verified it when I boarded. Could you point out exactly what you're seeing that appears irregular? Other passengers were now leaning in to hear Captain Hastings' response. The conversation had taken on the tone of a professional discussion rather than a heated argument, which made the captain's inability to provide specifics even more obvious. Robert, the passenger in 2B, spoke up. "Captain, I watched this gentleman board normally. The flight attendant checked his boarding pass and welcomed him to his seat. I didn't see anything unusual about the process." Captain Hastings shot an irritated look at Robert. "Sir, I need you to stay out of this. This is between me and this passenger." "Actually," Marcus interjected gently, "this is happening in a public space with multiple witnesses, so other passengers have the right to observe and even comment on what they're seeing. But more importantly, Captain, you still haven't answered my question about what specific safety issue you've identified." The silence that followed was telling. Captain Hastings realized he had painted himself into a corner. He couldn't articulate a legitimate safety concern because none existed. His demand had been based on racial bias, pure and simple, and now that bias was being exposed in front of dozens of witnesses and multiple recording devices. Marcus sensed that this was the moment to reveal more about who he was and what he was capable of doing in response to this discrimination. "Captain, since we're talking about flight safety and proper procedures, let me share some additional context that might be relevant to this situation. I'm currently traveling to Atlanta to conduct a comprehensive safety audit of aircraft operations for one of our major airline clients. This audit will examine everything from crew training and passenger safety protocols to compliance with federal anti-discrimination regulations." Marcus paused to let this information sink in before continuing. "As part of this audit, I have the authority to interview crew members, review training records, and investigate any incidents that might indicate broader systemic issues with safety culture or regulatory compliance. I also have a direct reporting relationship with several departments at the FAA, including the Office of Civil Rights." The implications of Marcus's words were becoming clear to Captain Hastings and to the passengers who were listening. This wasn't just a case of discrimination against a random passenger. It was discrimination against a federal inspector with the authority to investigate exactly these types of incidents. But Marcus wasn't finished. "Now, Captain, I want to give you an opportunity to reconsider your position. If you believe there are legitimate safety concerns about my seating arrangement, I'm happy to work with you to address them through proper channels. However, if your concerns are based on factors other than legitimate safety issues, factors that might violate federal anti-discrimination laws, then we have a much more serious problem on our hands." The cabin had gone completely quiet. Even the flight attendants had stopped their pre-flight preparations to listen to the conversation. Everyone understood that they were witnessing something significant, though most probably didn't grasp the full implications of what Marcus had just revealed about his authority and position. Captain Hastings looked around the cabin, seemingly realizing for the first time how many people were watching and recording the interaction. He was facing a choice: admit that his demand had been inappropriate and back down, or continue to insist on Marcus's removal and face the inevitable investigation that would follow. "I need to consult with my crew," Captain Hastings said finally, clearly stalling for time while he figured out his next move. "Of course," Marcus replied. "Take all the time you need. But while you're consulting, I'm going to make a phone call of my own." Marcus retrieved his phone from his jacket pocket and began scrolling through his contacts. The cabin remained silent, with passengers and crew members alike watching to see what would happen next. Captain Hastings had retreated toward the galley area, where he was engaged in what appeared to be an intense whispered conversation with the lead flight attendant. "I'm going to call my colleague at the FAA," Marcus announced, speaking loudly enough for Captain Hastings to hear. "Dr. Patricia Chin is the Regional Administrator for Civil Rights Compliance in the Great Lakes region. She handles investigations of discrimination complaints against airlines and airline personnel." Marcus dialed the number and waited for the call to connect. While he waited, he continued speaking, partly to Dr. Chen's voicemail and partly to educate the passengers about what was happening. "Dr. Chen, this is Marcus Washington. I'm currently on Flight 447 from Chicago to Atlanta, and I'm experiencing what appears to be racially motivated discrimination from the flight crew. The captain has demanded that I move from my assigned first-class seat to coach, citing vague safety concerns that he cannot articulate. When I identified myself as an FAA-authorized inspector, he became even more confrontational. Marcus paused, looking directly at Captain Hastings, who was clearly listening to every word. I'm going to need to file a formal complaint and request an immediate investigation. The captain's behavior suggests either inadequate training on anti-discrimination policies or willful violation of federal regulations. Either way, this appears to be grounds for both individual disciplinary action and a broader audit of the airline's compliance programs. Marcus ended the call and immediately dialed another number. Now I'm calling the corporate compliance hotline for this airline, he announced. As someone who regularly works with airline safety and compliance departments, I can tell you that incidents like this are taken very seriously at the corporate level, especially when they involve federal inspectors. The second call connected, and Marcus spoke to what was apparently an automated system for reporting compliance violations. This is Dr. Marcus Washington, FAA Authorized Inspector Number 7429. I need to report a potential federal discrimination violation involving one of your flight crews. I'm on Flight 447, departing Chicago O'Hare for Atlanta. The captain, who I believe is named Richard Hastings based on the pre-flight announcement, has demanded that I vacate my assigned first-class seat and move to coach. When asked to explain his safety concerns, he was unable to provide any legitimate justification. Marcus provided his contact information and inspector credentials to the automated system, which assured him that a compliance officer would be contacted immediately to begin an investigation. By now, Captain Hastings was looking increasingly uncomfortable. What had started as a simple demand for a passenger to change seats had escalated into a formal federal investigation involving multiple regulatory agencies. But Marcus wasn't done making calls. My third call is to my company's legal department, Marcus announced. Apex Aviation Solutions has a team of attorneys who specialize in aviation law and discrimination cases. They also handle our company's relationships with major airlines, including this one. This call connected to a live person, apparently Marcus's assistant at Apex Aviation. Jennifer, it's Marcus. I need you to conference me in with David Rodriguez in legal immediately. I'm dealing with a discrimination incident that's going to require formal legal action. Within minutes, Marcus was speaking with David Rodriguez, the chief legal counsel for Apex Aviation Solutions. Marcus put the call on speakerphone so that everyone in the first-class cabin could hear the conversation. David, I'm on Flight 447 to Atlanta, and I'm experiencing racial discrimination from the flight captain. He's demanded that I move from my assigned first-class seat based on what he claims are safety concerns, but he cannot articulate any legitimate safety issue. I've identified myself as an FAA inspector, but he's continuing to insist that I move. David Rodriguez's voice came through clearly over the phone's speaker. Marcus, are you recording this interaction? I'm not, but multiple passengers are recording with their smartphones, and I assume the aircraft has security cameras as well. Good. Don't move from your seat unless there's a genuine safety emergency. What you're describing is a clear violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. I'm going to contact the airline's corporate counsel immediately to put them on notice that we're dealing with a potential federal civil rights violation involving one of their employees discriminating against a federal inspector. The impact of this conversation on Captain Hastings was visible. He had gone from confident authority figure to someone who clearly realized he had made a serious mistake. The passenger he had tried to humiliate and remove was not only a federal inspector with significant authority, but also someone with direct access to high-level legal representation and corporate connections. David Rodriguez continued speaking over the phone. Marcus, I want you to document everything. The captain's exact words, any witnesses, the flight number and crew information. We're going to file both a federal discrimination complaint and a formal complaint with the airline. This kind of behavior is absolutely unacceptable, especially when it's directed at someone in your position. I'm documenting everything, David. I also want to note that several passengers have witnessed this entire interaction and are recording it. The passenger in 2B can confirm that my boarding process was completely normal. Robert, the passenger in 2B, nodded and spoke up. That's absolutely correct. I watched this gentleman board normally, and I heard the flight attendant welcome him to his seat. There was nothing unusual about the process whatsoever. David Rodriguez's voice took on a more formal tone. Captain, I don't know if you can hear me, but I want you to understand the legal implications of what you're doing. You are discriminating against a federal inspector based on what appears to be racial bias. This is a violation of federal civil rights laws, federal aviation regulations, and your airline's own anti-discrimination policies. I strongly advise you to reconsider your position immediately. As Marcus continued his phone conversation with his company's legal counsel, the lead flight attendant, Sarah, approached Captain Hastings with what appeared to be urgent information. She was holding a tablet and speaking in hushed, rapid tones. From her body language, it was clear that she was delivering news that the captain did not want to hear. Sarah had been in contact with the airline's operations center, reporting the unusual situation developing on Flight 447. When she provided Marcus's name and credentials to the operations team, it had triggered immediate alerts throughout the airline's corporate structure. Apex Aviation Solutions was one of the airline's primary contractors for safety systems and regulatory compliance. Marcus Washington was not just any federal inspector. He was someone with direct influence over contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars annually. More importantly, he was scheduled to conduct a major safety audit that could affect the airline's ability to operate certain aircraft if serious deficiencies were found. The operations center had immediately escalated the situation to the airline's senior management team, including the chief operating officer and the head of corporate compliance. Within minutes, both executives were on a conference call with the airline's legal department, trying to assess the potential damage from Captain Hastings' actions. Sarah returned to Captain Hastings with instructions from corporate headquarters. Resolve the situation immediately, ensure that Dr. Washington was treated with the utmost respect and professionalism, and do everything possible to prevent this incident from escalating into a formal federal investigation. But it was too late for damage control. Marcus had already set in motion a chain of formal complaints and investigations that could not be easily stopped or contained. Captain Hastings finally approached Marcus's seat again, his demeanor noticeably different from his earlier confrontational stance. Dr. Washington, he began, his voice lacking the authoritative tone he had used before. I've been in contact with our operations center, and it appears there may have been some confusion about this situation. Marcus looked up from his phone, where he was still connected with David Rodriguez. What kind of confusion, Captain? Well, there seem to be some misunderstandings about your credentials and your business with our airline. I want to assure you that we value our relationship with Apex Aviation Solutions and certainly didn't intend to cause any problems. The shift in Captain Hastings' tone was remarkable. He had gone from demanding that Marcus move to the back of the plane to acknowledging their business relationship and trying to smooth things over. But Marcus was not interested in accepting a superficial apology that didn't address the underlying issue. Captain, let me be very clear about something. The problem here isn't confusion about my credentials or my business relationship with your airline. The problem is that you demanded I move from my assigned seat based on assumptions about whether I belonged in first class. Those assumptions appear to have been based on my race, not on any legitimate safety concerns. David Rodriguez's voice came through the phone speaker. Captain, this is David Rodriguez, Chief Legal Counsel for Apex Aviation Solutions. What Dr. Washington is describing constitutes racial discrimination under federal law. The fact that you're now trying to frame this as a misunderstanding about business relationships doesn't change the discriminatory nature of your initial actions. Captain Hastings looked around the cabin, clearly aware that dozens of passengers were listening to this conversation and that many were recording it. The viral potential of the situation was becoming more apparent by the moment. I want to assure everyone that there was no discriminatory intent in my actions, Captain Hastings said, though his words lacked conviction. Then please explain your intent, Captain, Marcus replied. You demanded that I move from my assigned seat, claiming there were safety concerns or irregularities with my boarding pass. When I asked you to specify those concerns, you couldn't provide any details. When I showed you my credentials as a federal inspector, you became